So starting from my right here, we have Peter Welsh, who is the director of the Central Division, Arizona Historical Society. Next, we have Judith Stark, who's a professor in our own Department of Philosophy at Seton Hall University. Then Bob McDonald, who's president emeritus of the Museum of the City of New York. Then Emlyn Koster, who's a neighbor almost around the corner, president and CEO of the Liberty Science Center in Jersey City, New Jersey. And then Richard Sandell, who you all know from his keynote, and who's the director and head of museum studies at the University of Leicester. And we're going to start today actually with just a few minutes first of Judith speaking on applied ethics and museum ethics. One of her specialties in the Department of Philosophy is applied ethics. So that's one thing we haven't really heard much yet today. So she's going to just talk just for a couple of minutes about philosophy, applied ethics, and museum ethics before we start our conversation. Then we're going to have a few minutes on the panel talking, then we'll open it up to you. And just when we go over to the reception, just to let you know, there will be a book signing of Richard Sandell's books and also of Gary Edson's book. So that's a special treat to let you know about a little later on. Okay. Judith, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. You might think it's a little dangerous that I've stood up at the podium. Actually, I think it is too, because once I'm up here, it might take Janet to get the hook to get me off. So a couple of colleagues said to me as I was out there during the break, oh, now you're going to clear everything up. No, as a matter of fact, I'm not. I'm not going to clear it up. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to start with the survey that we all took this morning. And the first question on the survey and your responses I found fascinating. Can you remember that far back of what it was? That the first question was whether or not ethics is a fixed set of principles or whether ethics is always changing. Anybody remember the breakdown of that? 14% of you. I want to know who you are. I want to know that 14%. 14% of you said you thought it was a fixed set of principles. 86% thought it was always changing. Now, Janet just said to me she was going to do the survey again, and I said, wait, don't do it yet. Wait until we're finished this panel. Not that I think I'm going to change anybody's mind necessarily, but I do want to raise a couple of questions simply about that question, because I found it fascinating that that was the response. And I think I would have construed it slightly differently, that the set is not fixed. It's not a fixed set, but I would say some of the principles are set. Some of the principles are set. Now, if you know anyone who teaches philosophy or anyone who's a philosopher, you probably know that we philosophers spend an enormous amount of time and energy arguing with each other and debating about many of these issues, and especially in this area of ethics, which would be called ethical theory. And Janet did mention that I also work in areas of applied ethics. But there's a pretty common agreement among philosophers of what those principles are, depending upon the theory. And I'm not going to go through a lot of these theories because this is not the time and the place to do it, but I was so fascinated as I heard these papers, and I got them ahead of time, and I read them ahead of time. And today I was sitting in the back there and I thought, oh, great, my ethical antennae are up. And boy, were they buzzing. There was so much embedded in these papers. These papers were wonderful. They were so rich. They were so complex. They're so messy. And this is what happens when you try to apply these theories to actual situations. Theories like utilitarianism always choose what will result in the greatest happiness or the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. Or a theory that is derived from Immanuel Kant, which is called respect for persons. Always act in such a way in which you acknowledge that a person is an end in himself or herself and not a means to an end. Or virtue ethics, coming from Aristotle. I have my little pocket Aristotle with me today because I was going to just refer a little bit to the opening of his wonderful treatise on ethics called the Nicomachean Ethics, in which he talks about what's the nature of ethics and what's the nature of the kinds of truths that we're trying to find in ethics. And he says very clearly there, we can't expect absolute precision in ethics. So I'm sorry to deflate all your expectations. You're not going to get absolute precision. You will get probability, and you will get good arguments. And Aristotle says right there at the outset, we are looking for the truth roughly and in outline. And it's the mark of an educated person not to expect an exalted amount of precision in a subject that does not have it. And that's his caveat at the beginning of this great work, the Nicomachean Ethics. So all of these areas are what are called, among philosophers, theories about ethics. And then these theories get applied to the kinds of situations that many of which we've heard about today in an area of museum ethics. I have to just put my credentials on the table. I'm not an expert in museum ethics. I'm about to teach a course in it, and thank goodness Emlyn is going to be co-teaching with me. But you people today and the people on the panels and the questions that have been asked have really helped me enormously to detect within the issues that you are struggling with, what are precisely the ethical dimensions that are in those kinds of dilemmas that you are facing. So I see myself, and I think that at the last panel, struck a wonderful note of the interdisciplinary nature of the business at hand, because it is. No one owns this. I don't own ethics. I mean, the fact that I do some work in the field, yes, gives me a certain amount of understanding of it, but it's not as though we can't and we need to enter into conversation with one another, nor do I see myself as the New York Times ethicist. You know, in the magazine section on Sunday, Randy Cohen, you know, just send in your questions and I'll give you the answers. It doesn't work that way. And if I have a couple of, I don't want to spend too much time because we need to hear from other folks as well, but what I really thought about, and I don't know if this would help Janet at some point, but I really looked at kind of what I call the ethics backstory in a number of the papers that were given today. In other words, to kind of tease out what is it that's operating in the ethical dimensions behind the kinds of issues, challenges, conflicts that you folks are talking about today. And I don't know if I should do this now. Should I mention one or two of these, kind of this ethics backstory on this, Janet? Or, I mean, you're the timekeeper here. You can tell me whether I should.
A couple of themes and patterns that you see.
Okay, so just about the original survey, though, that was given, it was so interesting to me, as I said, that 86% of you thought that ethics is always changing. See, I would construe that slightly differently. I would say the applications of the principles is what is changing. The principles themselves are not changing. As I said, there's a fair amount of consensus, really unbelievable consensus among philosophers about the integrity of those principles. There's a lot of debate about how to justify those principles, but those principles are fairly well in place. The difficult part is, and this is why many of my colleagues in philosophy want to stay on the level of the theories of ethics, because for them you can just argue about the integrity, the validity, the arguments about the theories of ethics. It's a lot harder to apply these. It's much more difficult, and that's where I think a kind of paradigm, as Jürgen Habermas has developed, which is called discourse ethics, and again, if I had a little more time, I'd develop this, but where the discourse ethics really provides a kind of model for negotiating ethical dilemmas in which all stakeholders are identified and all stakeholders participate. And everyone who is affected by the decision has to be able and willing to live with the consequences of whatever policy or whatever practice is being construed, which is dialogical and difficult to achieve. But I think the model, this is a model that I've used in some work I'm doing in environmental ethics, on ecotourism. It's a very interesting model, and again, if Janet wants some references to that, I'd be happy to provide them. Well, I think I won't do the backstory, because I could talk a little bit about that, but I wanted to at least to set out some of these things about the nature of ethics. Thanks.
I may, I'd like to follow up on that because I was struck by that number of 86% also. But I framed it in a somewhat cruder way in that what it tells me, what it says to me, and it says to me anyway, is that I can count on, at some point in the future, being considered a fool. That, because we've all been there. We've all looked back 50 years, 100 years, and said to ourselves, what were they thinking? What were they doing? Now, I'm no smarter than those people. They're just as smart as me. They're just as ethical as I am. But I look back at what they were doing and said they were fools. I mean, I don't really say that, and I don't expect you to say that about me, please. But that kind of movement of ethics is one that I think we can expect. I was thinking about sort of where might we be headed. And one of the things that struck me, for instance, was the conversation this morning about Rosa Parks' bus. And it caused me to think, because before coming here, I looked at lots of ethics codes and where they were. And every one of them identifies ownership at the institutional level as a key component of ethical behavior, that collections are owned by institutions. And I thought, now is that really going to hold fast? What causes institutions to be this sort of a capitalist, possessive individualist kind of concept of where do things belong? I'm perfectly willing to believe that there will come a time when museums start acting a little bit more like zoos, where zoos think of their collections, the living collections, as having a more common ownership, and that they will move more comfortably from one institutional setting to another. So, and when that happens, we'll all look like fools. The second thing I guess I wanted to introduce to this conversation, I'm an anthropologist by training. I have ended up in the historical museum, and there's not much difference. But and until recently, I'm a recent refugee from the academy. I was teaching museum studies for the last 15 years or more. And but one of the things that anthropologists have the luxury of doing is asking the question of what makes us human. And we have the opportunity to look back in time and ask that question. And so we look at things like the beginnings of art, and I hold that what makes us human is the capacity to be confused, the capacity to recognize and act on contradiction. I've got a dog. My dog doesn't worry about things like that. I don't think chimpanzees get anxious about paradox, but humans do. And it's the presence of paradox. It is ethical conversations occur in the environment where we are conflicted, where there's moral ambiguity. And we look to an ethical framework to resolve that, to bring us back into focus. So I heard a lot today about ethical duty, without a lot of revelation about what were the considerations, what were the other options, that ethical duty seems straightforward and obvious to us in our moment. But again, if we put it in a historical framework, those obvious things often shift. And so those are the two notions I want to throw out.
Coming down the line.
Thank you. Well, let me begin by thanking Janet and the Institute of Museum Ethics and Seton Hall University, and congratulating the university and Janet and her group for addressing probably the single most important issue facing America's museums, in fact, museums throughout the world. And that is, how do we secure and maintain a museum's most important asset, in my view? And that's not the collections or the buildings. it's the public trust. And in my 47 years in museum work, I've seen public trust tested greatly among America's museums. And once lost, very difficult to regain. So when looking at the American museum community and its most important treasure, it is that public trust that museum ethics is designed to protect. The title of this conference is Defining Museum Ethics. And I came away and looking at the basically two perspectives presented today. One is that museum ethics can be defined to the extent to which a museum addresses socio-political issues of importance to diverse stakeholders. And we've heard some really wonderful stories about great programs that do that. On the other hand, there is a more traditional view of museum ethics, which defines museum ethics as the extent to which a museum abides by a code of standards of conduct drawn from professional tradition, which requires honesty, transparency, and loyalty to the museum's mission and our tradition of professionalism. I get a little queasy when you think of the obverse of hearing what is ethically responsible, we heard today in these programs. Is a museum unethical if it does not engage in activism, political activism, addressing very important issues? I think that is central to really helping us define what museum ethics is, and in the context of the mission of the institution. The James Adams Hall House, obviously, part of that mission is activism. But there are many other institutions and museums in the United States that do not have that as part of their mission. And that doesn't, in my view, make them unethical. I think that we have to be very careful in using terms like morality and ethics in the broadest sense of the term when addressing museums. I believe we need to be specific about talking about, when we talk about museum ethics, we're really talking about professional ethics, self-regulation through codes of conduct. It's very specific. It changes, it needs to change, and I would hope that the existence of this institute and the work of Seton Hall will add additional pressure on the American museum community to get back to really focusing on an issue that, in my view, has been ignored or put on the back burner for too long, since the original, not the original, but the most recent ethics code was approved in 1993. It's time to get back to the subject, in my view, and I would hope that the work of this institute will encourage those organizations responsible for pursuing those issues to proceed with haste and with thoughtfulness.
Thank you. I'd like to, like Judith referred to a survey earlier in the day, and that one was the one done informally by Jane Werner that revealed that there's one children's museum and one science center in the room and a handful of CEOs, if that was the correct finding. And one might take as a false correlation that since science centers classically don't have a collection, I guess they have no ethics. I won't speak for your field of museums, Jane. But that's not the case, of course, and it's disturbing, that result, because I think the cornerstone of the development of codes of conduct and ethics, we might all agree, has its relationship with the collection of the institution. And so to do this sort of time immemorial principles of we humans that distinguish us from other species, I don't think that those principles change, but as you said, Judith, I think it's in the application, it's in the horizon. And I think we have to lift the conversation out of the object and the artifact and the art and talk about ethics in the context of the purpose of the institution, whatever its means to that end. And clearly children's museums and science centers, which I know for science centers, when they came about in the early 70s, were not accepted by the museum community as being a legitimate part of the museum definition because they didn't have collections, and they went about to form their own association called the Association of Science Technology Centers And I don't know exactly, but I imagine that the origin of the Association of Children's Museums, which now co-meets with AAM, was equally sort of born out of a sense of difference rather than common ground. Otherwise, we'd all be meeting together. And we don't as much as we should. So the absence of CEOs in this room is indeed disturbing because, as my colleague to the right just said, if this is the most pressing, if defining museum ethics, the title of today's discourse, is the most important thing facing museums today, then where the hell are the CEOs? Because it's obviously not a leadership priority. So I think that's a noticeable gap in today. And the other comment I'd like to make is that we have predominantly spoken about the works of humans today, objects, artifacts, and art. Nature also needs its voice, and natural history museums have been absent from this dialogue. And as a geologist, I'm noting this. We have a future, if we go into the forthcoming decades, where more and more Earth and human affairs are going to be intertwined, and we humans don't have the luxury of living a world that is separate from our Earth surrounds, particularly as we invade more and more of it. And ethics is about our relationship with planet Earth and with the environment. So we need a voice for nature as much as a voice for the antiquities of humankind. And I would just like to end by saying that as we humans become more numerous on the surface of planet Earth and do more destruction and have great difficulty in reversing our adverse tread on the planet over the 20th century, it's easy to get sort of into the details of our collections and look at object by object. But let's just also remind ourselves that when it comes to an organization like UNESCO, they're into recognizing parts of civilization and parts of nature that must be preserved for all humans for all time and for the benefit of the planet. World heritage sites, world cultural sites are, if you will, entities, holistic entities of collections of which our museums may have parts, but they need to be preserved in a holistic sense. And those two horizons of places and scenery of outstanding preservational importance, the natural history, the absence of CEOs, and the disconnection of children's museums and science centers from this dialogue, I think are the disturbing things that I have noticed today, while I would also richly complement all the dialogue that has occurred.
Okay, I'm just going to make a couple of brief comments, and the first is probably to kind of clarify, probably in the light of all the fantastic work I've heard about today, my definition of activism. I think it's a word we use in quite different ways, and it has tremendous, a whole range of connotations. And I think the way in which I was using it, there's, as we heard from the Adams House, the kind of history of activism and how that is played out in the mission of that organisation. The 9 museums we worked with on the Disability Project were not museums with such a particular history as the Adams House, but the activist intention within those museums is about being what our colleague in Canada, Robert James, would call being mindful, being reflexive, being aware that the decisions that were made on a day-to-day, curatorial decisions on a day-to-day basis do have social effects and consequences, and the absences in our displays are as telling and as powerful as the issues that we address, and that there is no neutral position on some of those topics. And it's not easy work, but that, for me, the activism was being explicit about acknowledging that what we do, the work that we do, does have those effects and consequences, and therefore there's a tremendous responsibility on all of us to do that in a mindful, reflexive way. That's perhaps not quite so radical as many people might expect to have associated with that term, activism. My second brief point really echoes Emmeline's, I think, which was there has been a real, we've been exposed to a really exciting and inspirational range of work today. I'll take away a huge amount from my co-speakers and presenters. But Judith talked about the principles and the consensus that generally exists, and it'd be great for, I'll ask for discuss that further, because I wonder if, I can see that on a philosophical level, there is a degree of consensus around what might constitute ethical practice. I'm not sure that there is yet in museums, because to what extent are we preaching to the converted in this room? And those people that don't turn up, that don't engage in these debates, I think hold a very, very different view to many of us. We've had great debates at that level of how can this work proceed forward in a really creative and purposeful way. But we're taking a huge amount for granted because we do share certain agreement on principles. But I know that certainly in my own experience, that those principles are not consensual across the whole sector. And there are many who would argue that it's absolutely fine for museums to continue to cater for a particular minority of the population, that it's fine for museums to not accommodate and respond to the environmental, the cultural, social, educational inequalities in the communities that they exist in. Thank you.
All of these papers have, I think, speak to the necessity of developing public trust, and I certainly agree with Bob on this issue. They also lead me to say we have a lot of work to do at the IME. It's exhilarating, it's exciting, but I would say that while there is much agreement even among us, there's also disagreement among us, which in itself is exciting and lots to think about. So I think that's part of what makes museum ethics so compelling, is because there are so many different opinions about it. Coming from, even the concept of, of business ethics, what that might mean versus social responsibility. I've been in so many different panels where I've heard people say, these are two totally different issues, and one has nothing to do with the other. But as far as I can see, if you don't have your, if you don't have your house in order in terms of financial responsibility, how can you have good programming? You can't have one without the other. And so there are many, many contentious issues that need to be discussed. And so I think that the Institute of Museum Ethics fills an important need. So this is only the beginning, hopefully. We get more funding. Judith?
I just want to pick up a couple of points and talk a little bit about the issue of the level of principle and the expansion of principle. And a good example of that, I think, is Richard Sandel's paper this morning about disability rights and locating that within the larger discourse of human rights. And that's one of the ethical theories, certainly, that's been developed as early as Enlightenment. One might even go back to the Stoics and Jewish, Christian, Islamic philosophy. But apart from all the origins of that, that's the discourse. And that discourse on human rights, and the principle is there that an entity that has rights is worthy of moral consideration. Now, that's the principle. Fine. Sounds great. Very abstract. The nuts and bolts of that is to say, what entities have rights? Did black males have rights? Non-whites have rights? Did women have rights? All of those were contested, and over many, many years, with many, many struggles, the principle did not change. The expansion of the principle, the understanding of the principle, the application of the principle changes. We get more and more deeper understanding of that in doing that. Oh, and let's mix it up even more and say animals also have rights. Oh, let's even say, as I saw in an article in the newspaper just the other day, about the Swiss government invoking an ethics panel to discuss whether or not plants have rights. Aldo Leopold, many years ago in the 1940s, talked about ecosystems having integrity and rights. So again, the principle is there, but it's the articulation, the expansion of it, the application of it, and it's the application that's the difficult part of this. And I'd even refer to Jane Werner's paper, you know, with the lead building and the work being done on that small, was it 1 acre garden plot, you know, and you know, why do you want things like bioswales and pervious pavement surface? You know, what's the point of doing that? Or why even have a lead building? Well, a lead building is more environmentally friendly, doesn't use resources as much, it recycles resources, it doesn't create as many emissions, greenhouse gases, all the rest of that. And that leads certainly to Emily's point about where is nature in this process? Where is nature in this part of this conversation? And how, as museum people, do you help your audiences and the folks coming to your museums understand obligations toward nature, as well as the traditional obligations that ethics usually points out, which would be obligations to persons, obligations to property, obligations to policies, and that would be your codes of ethics, and obligations to the practices, and I would understand your mission statements being as part of that. So again, expanding that to say, well, where are obligations to nature as well? So that makes it even more difficult now, doesn't it?
Sorry. It'll come back to you. I was just thinking about Richard's reference this morning to the backlash, because that, you know, where your ethical antenna went up, my ethnographer's antenna went up when I heard about the backlash, because I really want to know more about that. I want to know. I don't, you know, it doesn't satisfy me to attach a label to it, but to dig into that, to learn what that ethic is, and to create an understanding and a discourse about those competing ethical conditions, so that everyone can be at the table. And I guess the other point was with regard to all these really inspiring stories we've heard today. You know, somebody has to do it, and I applaud everyone who is really out there. I've just recently moved to my new position in the Arizona Historical Society. It would be extremely difficult to move my board. It's going to take a lot of work to get them to replicate many of the programs that we've heard about today. So I am full of admiration and inspiration hearing about all those things.
Let's open it up to the audience now. Who has questions from the audience? Yeah, come on up to the microphone.
Actually, sort of go back to the issue of that activism and responding to something that Bob, if you don't mind me calling you Bob, said about the two different kinds of ethics. And again, if we're grappling with this institute and with this discussion here about what ethics is it meeting professional standards? Is it honoring the professional standards and honoring the mission statement that the museum or institution sets out? Or is it doing more activism things? And of course, on one hand, as you said, there are some institutions which seem, right from their core mission, that yes, that is doing those outside things, serving communities, being active, being involved. But there are many institutions, so-called perhaps the universal museums or whatever, other museums that have been perhaps on the more resistant end or the backlash end of these discussions, will say that their mission is not to do those activist kind of activities, but perhaps is just to collect and acquire and to be encyclopedic or, present things in a neutral, contra your position, a neutral kind of way. And my question is, should these things are, I agree, sort of two different potentially conflicting kinds of ethics. And as we move on in the 21st century, as museums are more and more engaged or faced with challenges, economic, political, with visitation, etc., should those be not in conflict? And in fact, should where possible, and sometimes this is not possible with private foundations, et cetera, but should in fact mission statements change so that the museums that have mission statements, to honor them would be to sort of be neutral? Should museums explicitly change their mission statements so that the ethics of honoring the mission statements and honoring the professional standards are also the ethics of being engaged in the community and doing activist kind of outreach?
Well, as a good academic, my position is that I present the discourse. So I, good academic, I put in quotes. So what I feel my job is to inform my students and also to present the resources on our web portal to those who are interested about what's out there. So what is going on? What is the conflict? Have this discussion that was just up here, and let people know about it. So what is going on? What is the push and pull? And so people can make their own informed decisions for themselves. So it's not my job as director of the IME to necessarily tell people what to believe, although I have my own, my own opinions. But nonetheless, to tell them what the discourse is. Now, I have my own research agenda, but as director of the IME per se, and as a faculty member, it's my job to present what is this, this discourse.
If I just could comment, I think that museums should revisit their mission statements, if not annually, on a regular basis, at least every 3 years, and adapt those mission statements to the real world in which they live, in the best interest of their institution and the people they serve. The other point I'd like to make is that there is activism that is unethical. And throughout history, museums have been used as active purveyors of hate, of discrimination. Just in my own case, I was director of the Louisiana State Museum for 11 years, but back in 1915, that museum set out to collect materials related to slavery and African Americans. And turns out that museum has one of the great collections on that subject in the country. But the purpose of that activism was to underscore white superiority. During the 1930s in Germany, museums were used to denigrate Jews. So we have to be very careful about when we use museums in that way, in a proactive, activist way, because your progressivism might be against my ideas, and so on and so forth. And it is up to us as professionals, as Janet just noted, to try to step back. We are custodians of collections of ideas. We need to step back and not interject ourselves too much of our political views, but to make sure that we present a balanced dialogue to our audiences. So I think this is one of the excitements of the question of museum ethics. I'll just conclude by telling you this, that the current code, AAM code, the beginning of developing that was in 1985. And in 1991, it was passed in Denver at the AAM annual meeting. Within 6 months, it was suspended. Under pressure for 2 reasons. It was not enforceable in the sense that the AAM was acting as a Supreme Court, but to be a member of the AAM, you had to develop your own ethics code, institutional code, that conformed to the AAM code. And the other one was the use of funds from deaccessions or sale of collections. Fortunately, I think it was 2 years ago, the AAM has now made a conformance to that code part of the accreditation process. So there is this growing understanding that a code needs to be enforceable, but in a voluntary way. If you don't want to belong to AAM or don't want to be accredited, you don't have to have a code. So that's kind of jumping from 3 items, but mission is central. Mission needs to be revisited regularly in light of the needs of the society we all serve.
I just don't want a misunderstanding that, I wasn't saying that museum staff members should not be activists.
I think that different museums, different case scenarios. So I wasn't by no means saying that Lisa Lee should not be an activist, and I applaud her for what she is doing, very much so. So by no means, I was saying that as director of the IME, my job is to present both sides of, or it's not just necessarily two, I'm not presenting it as a dialectic either, but that I should present the entire discourse and not necessarily my agenda. Did you have something to say, Lisa?
Can you tell?
Yeah. Yes, please do.
Oh my gosh, I love this conversation so much. So the thing that I would say is I do think that the public trust is the sort of foremost thing that public institutions must sort of hold, cherish, preserve, and sort of advance. The question is, which public and who's public? I mean, we all know that there are multiple publics. And so, for example, I'm on the board of this Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and there's sort of the notion that our public is X. We've also realized that our public is increasingly sort of aging, they're white, they're sort of, a particular zip code. And so the question for us is, well, how do we actually speak to multiple publics and sort of have the trust of sort of society as a whole and sort of build a sort of common good? I also am the chair of the Historic House Museum Committee of the AAM, and I'm very lucky because I work at the Hull House Museum. So my sort of work, really dovetails with the history of the Hull House. But in my conversations with all the different sort of historic house museums that we represent, this question, I think, applies to almost everybody. This question of whose stories are we telling, whose stories are we not telling, which objects are we collecting, which objects are we not collecting. And so I think the sort of stance that we could somehow be neutral and not step into a very messy sort of political conversation that would engage of issues of class and race and gender and all these issues which I think inform the daily lives of all of us as a people is a mistake, and that somehow I very much agree with the stance that everything that I think, that I know, tomorrow is going to be outdated, right? And so, but the question is then, how do we be as transparent about our motives so that when somebody steps into the Hull House Museum, they will know immediately that we are a peace museum and that this is how we define peace, and then to create an opportunity for people who disagree with us to have as equal a chance to express that viewpoint, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a very quick comment. Absolutely right to be careful about the political uses to which museums have been put, and absolutely right to look back historically and see those dangers. But without the kind of activism that I'm referring to, you wouldn't have African American museums, you wouldn't have museums that tell stories about women, because you don't have to look back that far to see museums that really did not tell a diverse range of stories that Lisa's referring to. And the kind of activism I'm talking to is that mindful reflexiveness. It's looking at changing society. It's looking at I appreciate that the kind of human rights discourse is open to debate, but there are nevertheless those principles there which can really be useful and guide us and be used as a lens to be more mindful and to change what we do, often in subtle ways. But without that kind of level of thinking, you wouldn't have some of the museums which we all applaud and are comfortable with today.
One more comment and then...
Just to respond to that, a attitude I try to create in my own work and in the work of people around me is, rather than thinking of our institutions as either educational or learner-centered, in my ideal museum, our visitors would see themselves as complicit, as part of the creation of the message themselves. And that if we can provide the mechanism for them to see themselves in the process, then whatever outcome they have, well, I don't really believe I can control that, but my goal is to put them in the picture as much as having them be an audience to what I have to say.
No. Oh, she's gone. Can I make a comment, please, Judith? Excuse me, Janet. I got the microphone. I think that graduate studies in graduate centers for museum studies should absolutely be about developing critical thinking skills in the given field of endeavor, but I think there is a dearth of leadership in this field, and I'm going to not be too alarmist, I hope, when I use Titanic and geological metaphors here. We can discuss the position and the relative position of deck chairs on the Titanic, and we haven't altered the fact that we're heading towards sinking. Every sphere of planet Earth, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the humanosphere, and the lithosphere are all in trouble. And I think we increasingly realize that we need, since we're the predominant species of influence, we need a we future, not a me now mentality. And this issue of ethics needs leadership. Aristotle, who was quoted by Judith, wrote several thousand years ago that leadership is about the pursuit of positive consequences in the world. Our ethical constructs need to be talked up by CEOs and by those that we elect to lead our associations, because this is, if it is the most important issue facing our field, it sure doesn't feel like it in terms of the volume and frequency of the dialogue at the leadership levels of our field, and we've got to make it that way, urgently.
Amen. Amen.
All right, so very quickly then, let's just ask these questions again. All right?
Okay. I want a big switch on this first one.
All right.
Hey, getting up there. Getting up there. Thank you. Thank you, folks. Thank you.
All right. So, and this was the morning response. Okay, next question. Are worrisome business practices and issues of social understanding both equally valid areas of museum ethics? Yes. And this morning was? Okay, so just almost exactly the same. Next question. Does museum ethics prioritize objects or relationships among people? Okay. 74% to 26, and this morning it was, okay, wow, you guys stick to your guns. Does being an ethical museum professional mean also being an activist? Two of you tilted. 2%. Well, thank you very much.